Great. So it's really a pleasure to be here. First off, thank you for the invitation. And again, just so nice to actually see human faces in 3D for a change. So I'm going to talk about kind of the bigger picture of how these two fields of machine learning and fluid dynamics are growing together or colliding, if you will. Before I jump in, I want to acknowledge many great co-authors, collaborators, colleagues who have done a lot of the work I'm going to tell you about. So a lot of the dynamical systems work has been with Nathan Kutz, and a lot of the fluids work has been with Jean-Christophe Loiseau from Paris Tech, and then a number of our fantastic students and postdocs in the middle. Now, if it's okay with the organizers, I am more than happy to have you interrupt with questions during my talk. I think that's okay. Yeah, so anytime, please feel free to ask me anything in the talk, because I have about 4 times more material than I could fit in 30 minutes. And so if you're interested in something, we can kind of discuss that. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is covered in this review paper with Bernd Nowak and Petros Koumoutsakis. And this is really focused specifically on the field of fluid mechanics. But we do think about the broader fluid-related fields of plasma physics, atmospheric and geophysical fluid dynamics, and things like that. And I like this picture because I think that this gives at least a quick summary of my perspective on how machine learning is merging with the classical fields of theory and simulation and experimental fluid mechanics. And there's actually an interesting parallel between the rise of machine learning now and the rise of computational science in the 1980s. So in the 80s, it was common to hear emerging fluid simulators saying that in 20 and 30 and 40 years, we're not going to be running any more experiments. Boeing won't need any more wind tunnels in 40 years because simulations are going to cover this need. And that never really materialized, right? Experiments are just as important as they always have been. Simulations complement the data from experiments. And I think this is an important point for us, that machine learning is essentially a common data processing framework that complements the data you get from experiments and simulations. It is not going to put anyone out of business. It's not going to be replacing these fields. They're essentially very complementary. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to give you my perspective on how machine learning can be used to solve classical problems in engineering and science. So my passion is fluid dynamics, specifically fluid flow control, trying to not only understand but manipulate the behavior of complex fluid flows for some kind of an engineering objective. And the tasks that we have in fluid dynamics can often be posed as challenging optimization problems. So dimensionality reduction. We all deal with an exceedingly high-dimensional complex system that has millions, if not billions, of degrees of freedom needed to characterize this, at least in our simulations. So getting a good handle on that dimensionality can be posed as an optimization problem. Reduced order modeling, figuring out how those coherent structures co-evolve in time. Oftentimes we solve this by optimization. Sparse sensing, what sensors do you listen to in this system, and control. Again, these are all high-dimensional optimization problems. And so my kind of pigeonhole view of machine learning, and this is not 100% correct, maybe this is 90% correct, is that machine learning is essentially building models from data using optimization and regression techniques. And it is something we've been doing for at least 70 years, right? Since the Kalman filter in the kind of 1950s, we've been building models from data explicitly. And we've been doing this for hundreds of years before that as well, if you think about astrophysics. And so there is something new here because we have vastly larger amounts of data, and our optimization algorithms are much, much better than they were even 20 years ago, much more sophisticated. And so these machine learning algorithms are allowing us to solve these optimization problems that are highly non-convex and multi-scale. If you think about training a neural network, it's a very, very non-convex multi-scale optimization problem, a lot like a nonlinear dimensionality reduction in a fluid mechanics problem would be. And so I feel like these really, really go naturally together. My friend Nathan says these go together like peanut butter and jelly. They're just made for each other. These challenges in high-dimensional fluids problems and the emerging optimization techniques we have in machine learning. So what I want to do today is walk you through a couple of vignettes of how we can use relatively simple machine learning techniques to get models for complex fluids, specifically models that are interpretable and generalizable. Because we like to communicate. We don't just want an oracle to give us an answer. We want to be able to do science with these tools. And the reason that we believe that we can achieve some of these fluid dynamics goals in blue and some of the machine learning tasks in pink is essentially the same. In both cases, it's because patterns exist. The entire field of machine learning and much of the modern field of data-driven fluid mechanics is based on this idea that there are patterns that exist in your data. So I don't need to pay attention to every one of the million or billion degrees of freedom to achieve my goal of understanding prediction, estimation, and control. There are dominant coherent structures that emerge, patterns that emerge in your data, and these are what we're going to exploit for modeling, for estimation, for dimensionality reduction, for control. Okay, good. Everyone with me so far? All right, so I'm going to walk through actually 2 vignettes today. And if you want to read more about kind of how we extract these patterns, I'm sure that you all have very similar tools to what we use in kind of classical fluid mechanics. But Sam Tyra wrote a fantastic review paper on this in 2017. Okay, so the first vignette I want to tell you about is something that is relatively new. This has only been out from our lab in the last couple of years. And it's this notion of how to automate dominant balance or asymptotic analysis using modern data-driven techniques. So this is work by Jared Callahan, who's a fantastic PhD student in my lab. And what we're essentially going to do, so I didn't really know this until I started digging into it, but a lot of the applied math departments across the country grew up out of essentially fluid dynamics research in aerospace engineering and mechanical engineering and applied physics departments. And a lot of those applied math departments grew up to solve this dominant balance or asymptotic problem. So essentially, if you have a boundary layer, right, you can make fundamental arguments of which terms of the Navier-Stokes are active in different physical regions. And then through matched asymptotics, you can get reduced expressions that you can simulate faster or get analytical solutions for these problems. This is 1950s, 1960s math. A lot of really cool stuff came out of this. What I'm going to show you is how we can essentially, purely from data, build an automated version of this dominant balance procedure. Okay, so what dominant balance means, what we mean by dominant balance is specifically that in a complex partial differential equation like the Navier-Stokes equations, there will be different regions of space and time where only a subset of those terms are active and in a balance with each other. And the other terms might be nearly zero or quiescent. Okay? And that would again give us the ability to build a reduced order model, a reduced physical description. Maybe we can learn some dominant non-dimensional numbers that govern the transitions between those regions. So we're going to warm up on this Johns Hopkins turbulent boundary layer data. Okay, freely available. You can all download this yourself. And this is the first case Jared is going to look at. Okay, so if we take this data and we do something simple like compute a 2-dimensional Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equations in a 2D slice, you find that you have 6 terms in this equation. So this is going to be a baby example. We're going to find dominant balance in the 6-term Rand's equations. And for each of these terms, like the u bar x, you can actually compute that term and plot it everywhere in space. This is what it looks like. You can do that for all of the terms, all 6 of these terms in your Rand's equations. And right off the bat, you can see with your eyes this dominant balance happening, right? You can see that these 2 terms are large and in some kind of a balance in the outer boundary layer. You can see that there is this little bubble here in this kind of transitional region. You can see that there are different terms that are active while other ones are small or nearly zero. And so what you can essentially do for every point in space, there are 6 numbers associated with it for each of those 6 terms in the equation. And so we can plot every data point we have in equation space. It's an alternative representation. This is what the data looks like. Okay? Every single white point is a point in space. And you'll notice already that there appear to be these subspaces or these lines where the data collapses on. This, again, corresponds to these dominant balance regimes. So what Jared did, the first thing, is to apply a simple clustering algorithm to try to find these clusters. Again, this is like really simple machine learning. That's what I want to get across. You can get a lot with very simple tools. The next thing he did was apply subspace identification, sparse PCA, so that, for example, in this red region, he tries to find the subspace with as many 0 coordinates as possible. Similar for the purple and the blue and the green and so on. And now you can see that the red terms and the blue dots and the green dots all correspond to different subspaces of equation space, where only a couple terms are active. And since these correspond to spatial points, you can replot them in your boundary layer. And essentially, we learn from the data, from just having the governing equation and being able to compute each of the terms on the data, we essentially recapitulate the classic boundary layer theory. Now, this isn't perfect, but it's pretty good. We get the viscous and inertial sublayers, the transitional region. We get a lot of the basic features you see in boundary layer physics, and this comes out of the data. What I think is really cool about this, and this is the next paper we're writing right now, is essentially if you look at the interface between the viscous and inertial sublayers, you see that they actually share this one term in common. They have 3 terms if you look at them jointly, and they have 1 in common. So that should tell us a lot about what non-dimensional numbers would kind of mediate the interface between these layers. Yeah. So in the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equations, you average out time. So if we had, so this is again a warm-up problem. You can do this for time-evolving fields as well. It's a bit more expensive. Yeah.
I missed something that jumped from the picture of the data to a very specific. You assume the equation and pick the parameters.
This one here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a standard equation in turbulent fluids, the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes, where essentially what we're doing.
So you just assumed it.
We assumed it. This is a standard equation that we all agree on is some useful description. So we basically take a mid-plane slice, and we take an average that plane through all of time. So we get the mean flow, and then this is the equation that would govern the mean flow.
Then does it have parameters that were estimated from your data?
So that data is from simulation, and we know what those parameters are. So no parameter estimation needed. But we're essentially only computing the raw terms of the equation, and we're not including the parameters in our scatter. You could scale it that way. And now that I say it out loud, I'm actually not sure. I guess Jared does include the parameters in the scatter, so we are including the known parameters. Yeah, great question. Thank you. So this is predicated on you having an equation that you agree on that's interesting, that governs the large scale, like all of the physics. And then we're going to try to sub-select the terms of the equation that are useful. Yes.
So the sharp delineation.
You need to come to the microphone if you want to ask.
Yeah, just so that people out in the university. Thank you. The sharp delineation between the phases in your phase diagram, that comes from the sparsity constraint or from the physics?
The sharp delineation here?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. So why is it sharp and not more diffuse?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. So it is more diffuse in some regions. Here it's a little fuzzier. In the inflow, it's a little fuzzier. I would say that here it's because those terms really do kind of transition pretty sharply in those regions. Yeah, I think that's probably from the physics. Yep. Yes. Oh, okay, good. I will repeat. Yeah, I will begin repeating the question next time. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, good. So this is the basic idea. I think it at least paints a picture of what you can do. You compute each term. It's a really simple idea, plotting things in equation space, but I like this idea a lot. So we've applied this to a few other complex systems. This is the boundary layer I showed you. We tried this for a supercontinuum high energy laser. This is essentially a nonlinear optics problem where you have a very, very high energy pulse laser. And I like this example because physicists for a long time assumed that because this was such a high energy nonlinear system, that nonlinearity dominated kind of everywhere. But if you look at our space-time diagram here, this very thin blue ribbon is where the nonlinearity is actually active, or at least approximately more active than at other times. And so even though nonlinearity is very important in this problem, it is, relegated to a relatively narrow region of space-time, and it drives the rest of the physics that tend to be more linear. So that's kind of a new thing that we saw just by plotting an equation space. We've applied this to the Gulf of Mexico data from HICOM. So essentially, we wanted to see if we could relearn or recapitulate the different kind of geostrophic balances, zonal balance, and things like that. And here we actually get a pretty decent segmentation of the flow into two of the classic balance laws. And what I would be interested in, especially for all of you, so I'm by no means an expert here. We learned just enough to be dangerous in this example. But one of the goals would be to apply this method to something that's slightly less asymptotic, something that's slightly less well separated, maybe mesoscale dynamics in the open ocean, things where humans haven't been able to write down a nice balance, but maybe there are some of those patterns in the data that we can pull out. So that's what we would love to do. And then also, so my wife is one of the co-authors. She's this Brunton. And so she's a computational neuroscientist, and we've been applying this to brain data, both ordinary differential equations for individual nerves, but also for spatial temporal data on the brain. And in that case, you don't actually have governing equations we can agree on. So I'll tell you some techniques we have to kind of, what if you don't have a partial differential equation? Is a great question we should all be asking. And so that's something my wife is actively working on. I'll tell you about in a little bit. Okay, any questions about this dominant balance before I move on? And I would love to talk with many of you about this, throughout the day. Okay, good. I'm going to move on to the second vignette or window into what my lab does for machine learning in fluids. And that's specifically, how do we build reduced order models? How do we build simple ordinary differential equations like x dot equals f of x, where instead of x being a 1,000,000 degree of freedom vector that describes every single detail of this flow, maybe I can find 3 or 4 degrees of freedom that capture the dominant coherent structures I care about for my daily life, okay? And this is a real turbulent experiment from my colleague, Richard Zeman at TU Braunschweig. This is one of the examples of a flow we can model using these techniques. And about halfway through my talk, I have to give you my soapbox philosophy on machine learning. So we use deep neural networks plenty. Everyone in the field does. They're very, very powerful. But I want to point out that as scientists and engineers, we also want machine learning techniques that are interpretable and generalizable. And sometimes that suffers when you train everything in a deep neural network. And instead of trying to define what I mean by interpretable and generalizable, because I usually get into an argument, I'm going to give you my prototypical example, which is Newton's second law, F equals ma. This is, in some sense, kind of clearly interpretable. There are 3 terms in the equation, F, M, and A. They have units. We can write them down for a particular problem. We can go outside and discuss them. They're communicatable and interpretable and explainable. And they're generalizable in the sense that Newton can learn F equals ma from an apple falling on Earth. At least that's how the story goes. And it's still true when we land humans on the moon. That is a generalizable model. It works well outside of where you trained it. Now, I could build a neural network. We could build a neural network if we had videos of apples falling. Now, you might need 5,000 videos. But if we had 5,000 videos of apples falling, we could build a neural network that would make new videos of apples falling. But it's not going to be useful when we decide to land humans on Mars. Okay, so we want models that are more like F equals ma. In some cases, not in all cases, in some cases. And this is not just Newton. This has been a principle in physics from Aristotle to Einstein, what we call the principle of parsimony, that the way you get the bits that generalize, which is what we call physics, is to find a model that is as simple as possible, but no simpler. That's the principle of parsimony, Occam's razor. And mathematically, in the modern era, we have a couple of tools at our disposal to get models that promote that kind of parsimony. So the first tool is low dimensionality. Again, we all deal with very high dimensional systems. We need to extract key patterns that matter, coherent structures. Remember, patterns exist in your data. That's what we mean by low dimensional, finding those patterns. And then sparsity, I want my model, my dynamics that describe how those patterns co-evolve to be as sparse as possible. I want the fewest mechanisms that give me kind of the observed evolution of those low dimensional dynamics. So I'm going to be talking about how we can incorporate sparsity and low dimensionality into these machine learning techniques. And if we fast forward to the computational era, kind of 1963 Lorentz, this is the kind of model that I want my automated procedure to be generating from data. Okay, if we think about it, this model has the two hallmark features I mentioned before. It's low dimensional in the sense that it has three variables, x, y, and z, which are the amplitudes of three spatial modes, the Saltzman modes, for this chaotic Rayleigh-Bernard convection. And on the right-hand side, out of all of the possible terms that could describe my dynamics, this is extremely sparse. There's only a few terms that are needed to describe how x, y, and z co-evolve. In fact, there's 7 terms and 5 of them are linear. It would be hard to get a system simpler than this. Okay, we're trying. And I'll point out, at least by modern standards, I think we should remember Feder and Hamilton, who were graduate students with Lorentz. So Linda Feder and Margaret Hamilton were the graduate students who actually ran all of his supercomputer simulations that he used to generate this data. So important to remember them as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, again, an automated data-driven procedure using very simple techniques in optimization to learn these kinds of models, low-dimensional and sparse models for complex fluid flows. And we'll see how far I get. So we call this the sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics, or SINDI algorithm. It's been out for about 5 years. And I'm actually going to warm up on the Lorentz data. So we're going to assume that we're analyzing this Lorentz system, and we have measurement data, x, y, and z, but we don't know what the equations of motion are. They exist, but we don't know what they are. And we can compute the derivatives x dot, y dot, z dot. Now, by far the simplest thing you could do would be to build a linear regression model to fit x dot, y dot, z dot as a linear function of x, y, and z. That's what the dynamic mode decomposition does. I think this is called linear inverse modeling in the climate world. They're the same thing. And this is almost a cartoon of why this often doesn't work. Because we know that this little 3x3 A matrix with a single fixed point at the origin can't possibly describe this system that has multiple fixed points and unstable periodic orbits and chaos. So instead what we do is we augment our right-hand side with more candidate terms that could describe the dynamics. These are all things that can be computed from the x, y, and z that I've measured. I can compute x squared and xy and y squared and so on. And they don't have to be polynomials. This can be anything you think up. It should be guided by the physics. And often in fluids, polynomials tend to be a pretty good choice. And so now the objective, the optimization task, is to find the sparsest combination of columns of theta that add up to equal x dot, that add up to equal y dot, and that add up to equal z dot. This is a sparse regression problem. This, if you asked me 20 years ago, I would have said this is really, really hard. This involves a combinatorial brute force search through all of the columns. Now this is a commodity algorithm. There are 10 different algorithms to solve the sparse regression problem. We have our own custom variant. It's a relatively straightforward thing to do. And when you apply that sparse regression to find those fewest columns, you learn the structure of the nonlinear differential equation that generated the data in the first place. So what we learn is consistent with the governing physics that generated that data. Now, of course, this is a toy problem. This is a warm-up. We knew the answer. Okay, but I'm going to show you that you can use this for actual scientific discovery. Any questions about the basic setup before we get into some applications? Yes.
Yeah, in no point so far have you talked about noise.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, you didn't put noise in this, I guess, right? Or did you?
So in the original paper, we do look at noise. It tends to be moderately noise robust. So computing derivatives is kind of the nasty part. So you have to compute your derivatives in an intelligent way. There are plenty of algorithms now in the last 5 years that have essentially just addressed noise. So one thing you can do is kind of integrate both sides in an integral formulation. That helps a lot. You can do ensembling techniques. That's extremely noise robust. So again, 5 years ago, I'd say moderately. Now it's very, very noise robust. Yeah, good question. Other questions? Yes.
So what happens if you have only X and Y
Yeah.
data, or X and Z?
Okay, that's one of my absolute favorite questions. What happens if you only have X or X and Y, but you don't have all of the variables? And that was actually a reviewer comment when we wrote this paper. And it was probably the best reviewer comment I've ever had because it led to an entirely new paper and kind of an accidental scientific discovery. So I'll give you the short answer. The short answer is if you only measure this blue column X and you don't measure Y and Z, you can use time delay embedding, Tockin's theorem, so you can essentially create a new state of time delays of X. And the way we do it is we build this into a Hankel matrix, a time delay matrix. This is just what SSA does, singular spectrum analysis. You build a Hankel matrix and take its singular value decomposition. And I use those singular vectors as my coordinate system to build my dynamics in. Now, it turns out that some very, very weird things happen, and the sparsest dynamical system that's consistent with that data in those time delay coordinates is linear, honest to goodness linear, which means that there's connections to the Koopman operator, and that's a whole different story. But really, really good question. So yes, sometimes we can handle partial measurements if they are good partial measurements that allow us to do something like Tockin's embedding. Yep, great question. Other questions? Yes.
So is this on? Yes. I appreciate that the sparsity is essentially the parsimony that you were talking about earlier.
Yes.
But if the system was actually full, is the sparse essential in the system? I mean, in your method, I mean, do you rely on the sparsity, or could you solve for a full system too without any problems?
That's a great question. So maybe the system actually has all of the dynamics and it's not simple. So I get into this discussion with my wife all the time because we have lots of reasons to think that the brain is not going to have a sparse model. It probably doesn't. It's probably complicated. You could get rid of the S and call this INDI, the identification of nonlinear dynamics, sure. But I do think that if you find the right coordinate system, even very complex dynamics often begin to look sparser and simpler. So we know from like 1980s dynamical systems that there are these normal form coordinate transformations, relatively simple coordinate transformations that will kill most of the nonlinear terms. There will be some that are left that are essential. And so actually, maybe I'll just jump to that. So there is a variant of this, which we call SINDI autoencoder. So essentially for systems where we're not in the right coordinates. So maybe I will ask a related question, and it's also related to yours. So I assumed I knew the right coordinates to measure in the first place, X, Y, and Z. That was a huge assumption. Every example I have in this entire slide deck that I could show you, we assume that we know the right coordinates. Somebody told us the right way to measure our system. But if you don't know the right coordinates, if you only have partial measurements, or if you just measured the rotated Lorentz system, I would get lots more terms. It wouldn't be sparse. And so essentially, we have combined SINDI with an autoencoder neural network that finds coordinates. Essentially, what we want to do, I'm going to go back to this slide. So I've shown you about the sparsity. How do I get good low-dimensional representations in which the dynamics can be expected to be sparse? And so the way we do that is through these autoencoder networks, where you have high-dimensional data, you compress it down to a low-dimensional state, Z, assuming that you can decode it back to the high-dimensional state. And what we do is we put this custom dynamics block in the middle, a SINDI model, a sparse nonlinear model in the middle, so that not only can we get a compressed representation, but it has to be dynamically predictable in that compressed representation. So the singular value decomposition or principal components analysis, in fluids we call it proper orthogonal decomposition. I think in climate you call it EOFs, empirical orthogonal functions, that all amounts to the same thing. You can represent it as a linear autoencoder network. And so if you allow that autoencoder network to be deep and nonlinear with nonlinear activation functions, instead of learning a subspace that describes your data, you learn a submanifold. And we want to find a good submanifold where we can get sparse dynamics. So maybe just again, a little bit of philosophy here. The way I think about the importance of coordinates is, again, going back to Newton's second law and astrophysics. This is how we viewed where we live for a long time, right? We're the blue dot and everything else revolves around us. My kids still think that the world looks like this. And it's really hard to get F equals ma in these coordinates because weird things happen. Mars is going along and it turns around. That doesn't belong to F equals ma class physics. And so you have to get the right coordinate transformation first before you can expect your dynamics to be simple. I guess that's the point I really want to make, is that oftentimes you're one coordinate transformation away from having simple dynamics. And that's what this Cindy autoencoder does. This is Kathleen Champion's PhD work, is essentially to jointly learn coordinates and dynamics. Really good question, thank you. So I realize I have maybe 10 more minutes for questions. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a teaser. I showed you how Lorentz works on the Lorentz system, which is a little bit of a warm-up problem. We have applied this Cindy algorithm to model lots of complex systems in fluid flows and related fields. So things like the flow past a cylinder, relatively complex dynamics or high-dimensional dynamics of shear-driven cavity, electroconvection, experimental fluids, all the way up to fusion reactor tokamak data. And so maybe this is a good place for me to stop telling you things and just start listening to your questions. If you have questions about any of these fields, like how we apply them in fluids or how we bake in partially known physics, I can kind of zoom into these different pieces. So I'll stop here and I'll just take questions for the next 10 minutes. Thank you. Rose? Yeah.
Fascinating talk. I just have a question about the learning coordinate, because we know it's not unique in the latent space and we cannot control the dimension of the latent space. Could you comment more on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting, there's a whole set of really interesting questions in this, this autoencoder network. So yeah, so the first thing is that this coordinate transformation is it's not unique. There are many, many embeddings that will give you these low dimensional dynamics. And so what we originally tried to do was to learn the good coordinate system and then learn a Cindy model in that coordinate system. And it turns out that that doesn't work very well, because the best compression of your data typically is not the one that will make your dynamics sparse. And in fact, if you think about a good coordinate transformation that makes your dynamics sparse, like the Lorentz system being in the standard XYZ coordinates, even if I took that good compression coordinate system and I rotated it a few degrees, the dynamics are no longer sparse. And so really, we have to come up with this relatively sophisticated joint loss that kind of keeps the autoencoder and the Cindy intrinsically coupled. So this is the autoencoder reconstruction loss. That's just a standard autoencoder loss. And this is the standard Cindy loss. We want a sparse model, so we have a L1 penalty. But we have to have these additional terms in the middle that basically say that if I take my derivative and pass it through the autoencoder, that is also preserved. And similarly, if I lift from my latent space through the decoder, that derivative and state are also preserved. So these are essentially custom losses that allow you to keep the system coupled so that you're not only finding good coordinates, but coordinates where the dynamics are sparse. It is a relatively stiff optimization. That's the downside, is that this makes it quite stiff in the optimization. I'm not sure that entirely answers your question, but thank you. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That was a great talk. So when you learn here within this cost function, so basically within the loss, you actually, project onto this new coordinate system and then project back. But you're still learning a set of equation up to a linear transformation and some multiplicative factors, right? So is there a way, I mean, we can bake in some physics, for example, within it to make it, again, kind of maybe independent of, some of those transformations, or thinking about things like, Reynolds number or deformation scales.
Yeah.
So then those coefficients could be fed within the loss or within the input. If you have any thought?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Actually, so I think there's like 3 different good questions in that question. The first one is, if you know a key parameter of your system, like the Reynolds number or the Rayleigh number or the Mach number, you can actually build that into this theta library. So I can add columns like a control input or an exogenous forcing or a Reynolds number directly into this, this library here. And you can learn that parameterization. So that's one thing you can do. I feel like I should also show you some examples where we do this for simple coordinate transformations, like the proper orthogonal decomposition or EOF. Because that's where you can bake in physics. So you can absolutely put constraints on this Cindy model. I think this is a really important point, is that, for example, in the Navier-Stokes equations, we know that the equations are energy conserving for an incompressible flow, and we know how. It's because of a skew symmetry in the quadratic nonlinearity. And so in this Cindy model, we can add constraints on these coefficients, these sparse coefficients, so that if I get one quadratic term, I have to have its antisymmetric counterpart. And we've done that for fluid flows. And actually, we have a colleague in France at IMT Atlantique, Ronan Fablet, who has applied this to climate systems. They've done this exact architecture, Cindy autoencoder, and they've essentially added those skew symmetric constraints so that their models are energy conserving by construction, which makes a big difference. So if I go back to this slide here, so if we go back to a really simple example like flow past a cylinder, and let's say I put it into this orthogonal low dimensional coordinate system, so these 3 coordinates, in these 3 coordinates, my equation would become x dot, y dot, and z dot. And you can learn this with Cindy. You can build your library in those coordinates, and you get a nice identified system that has the right physics, low dimensional, it's sparse. This is all kind of history. What Jean-Christophe Loiseau from Paris Tech showed us was that because of the way that we are building our sparse models, any partially known physics constraint you have, energy conservation, mass conservation, any kind of symmetry, you can add as a set of equality constraints in your sparse regression. And that essentially allows us to bake in any of those symmetries or partially known physics that you have in your system. The other thing that you can do, again, to make the system more physical in that low dimensional coordinate system is to include higher order nonlinear terms. So we know that Navier-Stokes are quadratic. And so if I just did a Galerkin projection, I would get a quadratic differential equation. But if I allow myself to have higher order terms, cubic, quintic, septic, nonic terms, 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th order terms, you essentially would be able to account for the truncated low energy modes that you're disregarding. I'm building this model in terms of the first 2 energetic modes, that's X and Y, but I've thrown away modes 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8, all of my lower energy mode pairs. But we know that those dynamically re-enter the equation as 3rd and 5th and 7th order terms. And so that's a flexibility you have when you're doing the Cindy regression, is that you can include those higher order terms and essentially build a closure model for the low energy terms that you've neglected. Now, it's really dangerous to call this a closure model because this is a laminar problem, but it is closing the energy of this system. And our colleagues, Sarah Beetham and Jesse Capasalatro, have used this Cindy for actual turbulence closure modeling since then. So they've shown that this idea generalizes to real turbulence closures. So those are some of the ways we make this more physical, is embedding the physics through symmetries, using higher order terms for closures, things like that. And I guess the last one, sorry, it was such a good question. there are advances in neural network architectures that are essentially allowing you to build equivariant input and output layers that will, by construction, mean that your system is invariant to certain symmetry groups. And I think that's a huge direction. We haven't explored that yet, but I think that's inevitable for these architectures. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit about that first idea with finding the dominant balances, but when we don't have the equations. And also, I'm wondering if that's something that can be also applied on the Cindy basis functions first. Maybe find out, maybe there are different bases that would be important, find different equations for different regions.
Yeah, fantastic question. I'm really glad you asked because I was worried I wasn't going to get to show you this. So you can actually use that same sparse regression. So what if I don't have a good partial differential equation for my system? I can't do dominant balance. So you can essentially take this exact same Cindy idea, and this is Sam Rudy's PhD work when he was working with Nathan and me. You can take that same idea for spatial temporal data, and you can build a library of partial derivatives and product terms of partial derivatives. And now when you apply this sparse regression Cindy algorithm, you essentially uncover a PDE. So this is like actual Navier-Stokes equations you're learning from this data. So we believe that the next step for us is to simultaneously be learning the PDE equations using something like this Cindy procedure and learning the dominant balance in different subregions of which terms are active. We have a variant of this where you can also put candidate dimensional parameters and learn non-dimensional parameters through something like a Buckingham pi. So those three pieces together is what we're hoping will allow us to do this for systems where we don't have the physics, like the brain. But that's ongoing, so we don't have an answer yet. Okay, I think I'm out of time. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Great questions. Would love to chat with you all more.